Hi, so I want to talk about something that I think would be helpful, very helpful for a lot of people who are maybe through listening to what I've recorded on here, or maybe just they've started to suspect even without listening to the other things I recorded. But I want to speak to people who maybe started to realize that they have been emotionally suppressing, emotionally sterilized through the massive vilification of negative emotions, through the vilification of doubt within the spiritual community. And I've talked about this in other videos, some that I've already posted, some that I am about to finish and post, knock on wood. I'm pretty sure this will be up after those videos, or at least a few of those videos are up, so there's more context and background if you want to listen to it or listen to them, because it's multiple videos. But anyway, and I'm going to say what day it is, one, because I like to do that in general, but two, I think it's good for context so that you understand, like, based on when the other videos were recorded and stuff like that. I don't know. I think it's helpful. And also I just like to say it because I like to pay attention to dates and the relevance of certain dates. And I'm like, oh, that's why I was talking about that on that date, blah, 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 even if I wasn't aware of it at the time. So anyway, today's July 24th, which is 7:24, which if you do, I love to do this with with minutes, side note. So 7 minutes and 24 seconds is 444 seconds. And so it's July 24th. So I think there's like a lot of angel number value in today, personally. So anyway, so it's July 24th, and I want to say something that's, like I said, that I think can be helpful for people that suspect that they have been either toxically positive, emotionally suppressive, emotionally sterilizing, think that they've been dismissing doubt. Basically, if you've been doing a lot of law of assumption and or a lot of law of attraction and or a lot of law of detachment, chances are, in my opinion, you've been very emotionally suppressive, very emotionally sterilized. And even law of assumption does this. I know a lot of people say law of assumption is not, or a lot of people believe that law of assumption is not toxically positive. Well, I have thoughts on why it is, and I talked about that in another video that I'm going to post soon, and I think before this video. So anyway, by the time this goes up, that should have already been, I believe it will have been posted. So anyway, that'll be there for you to reference if you're confused about why I'm saying that law of assumption is toxically positive. Okay, so anyway, but if you've been coming from a place where you suspect that you've been toxically positive, I have a little bit of a potential solution for you. One, this isn't the thing that I was going to talk about, but this is also helpful. So one, prayer. Prayer is lovely. I think it leans you into God's grace, and through leaning you into God's grace and making you very vulnerable to God's grace, through requesting it of Him for yourself and for others. Obviously, you should be praying for others, not just for yourself. You should be praying for yourself and for others, and for God, I think, too, because that's a way of giving love back to God. But anyway, so, but I believe it makes you a vessel of God's grace when you lean upon His grace. And so prayer is very powerful, and I want people to pray, but it's not just prayer. There's another thing that I think is very, very helpful, and that is to operate from a place of love. But a certain avenue for operating from a place of love is to deeply value your emotions, not just your positive ones, but your negative ones as well, as communication from the soul. And I talked about this in another video that I'm probably going to link below by the time I post this video, whenever I post this. It might be September or October before I post this video, but I plan on posting it within the next couple of months. But anyway, this one that I'm recording now. But anyway, so, I'm trying to remember what I was saying because I lose my train of thought all the time. Okay, so yeah, so I don't want to pause the video to listen to it again right now to get my, remember where I was coming from. I don't feel like doing that right now, even though I do that all the time. So let's see, what was I trying to say? So anyway, so you're operating lovingly, and I think that emotions are a very valid communication, oftentimes a very valid soul-led, divinely led communication to you. And so you want to honor your negative and positive emotional expression. And if you want more explanation on why, like I said, that'll be linked below, because I'll have another video where I talk about that. And it's going to be a very long video. So I'll probably put minute notes so you can find the exact reference if you don't feel like listening to the whole video. Although I would love if you listened to the whole video. It'd be very nice. But if you're too busy, I understand that. So, okay. I think it would be nice for you to listen to it. But anyway, okay. So yeah, so I'm just going to go, because I don't want to give too much background, because that's part of why I have these long videos. So I just want to try and get to what I'm trying to say, which is one of the things you can do to be a vessel of love in this world. And that is to deeply revere your emotional communication. And because we are not trained to really listen to our emotions, we're trained basically to either suppress them or be totally swept away with them. And usually when we get or heavily swept away with them. And when we get heavily swept away with our emotions, it's typically ego-based emotions, is my understanding of it. It's not really divinely led. Now, the ego is important, and I'm not telling you to vilify your ego, but a lot of people have very inflated egos, right? And that's silencing their soul in a lot of ways. Even though there is a soul-ego connection, and again, I'm not telling you that the ego is bad. I'm just saying that, a lot of people are silencing their soul's communication through an inflated ego. Their inflated ego is very heavily silencing divine communication. Okay. Now, so a lot of people are coming from a place, in my opinion, in the spiritual community, a lot of people, the spiritual community, the new age community, the woo-woo community, you know what I'm talking about. I assume anyway that you know what I'm talking about. So a lot of these people are very emotionally suppressive. They've trained themselves to emotionally sterilize, in my opinion. And I want to normalize calling it emotional sterilization, because frankly, that's what I think it is. Okay. So, how do you train yourself to not emotionally sterilize? How do you train yourself to listen to your soul speaking to you again through its emotions, its positive and negative emotions, through honoring the sadness, the anger, the doubt, the confusion, the sense of lack, the loneliness, whatever it is, the fear, honoring the fear as well. And I talked about the value of fear. So if you're over here like, oh my God, what are you telling me to honor? Why are you telling me to honor fear? I talked about that in another video that I'll link below. I plan on linking below anyway. Okay. So you want to honor the negative emotions, and of course you want to honor the positive emotions as well. Okay. So to do that is really to anchor into the heart, because the heart deeply understands negative emotions and positive emotions. And I talked about the role of the heart and wounded love in another video called The Vilification of Fear in the Spirit, or not, that's not what it's called. I think it's something about that, but I think the video is called The Spiritual Community Vilifies Fear Way, Way Too Much. So in that video, I talked about the role of the heart in correspondence or in relationship with wounded love and love in general. Wounded love being your negative emotions, nurtured, healed love being your positive emotions. Okay, so you want to get in connection with that wounded love expression to you, as well as the nurtured, healed love expression to you. And if this doesn't make sense, I've explained it in other videos that I'm going to link below. Okay, So now I think I can get to what I'm trying to say, which, because I know that my thoughts are kind of out there, and so I feel like I have to give a foundation and explanation. So that's why I go into all these details a lot of the time. Okay, but anyway, so you're going to want to value your emotional communication. And so a way to do that, to be a vessel of love, one of the ways of being a vessel of love is to deeply honor your emotional communication. And as a divine expression, as a divine communication. And to do that, when we are not trained to really understand where our emotions are coming from in our society in a divinely led way, we're not trained to understand our emotions in a divinely led way, I want to help people start to have a relationship with their emotions in a divinely led way again. And so to do that, I think you can, because we're trained to be very mental and not very heart-led, I want us to start trying to understand where our heart's coming from with our mind. I want us to try to start understanding where our heart's coming from and our divinely led mind. Because I talked about how the ego suppresses the divinely led mind. I talked about that elsewhere a little bit. But anyway, I want you to start trying to understand where your soul is coming from with your mind. I want you to try to start understanding where your soul is coming from. And a big part of that is to understand where your heart's coming from. And so I've got a formula for that I'm going to try to explain. So basically, and I'm going to have to pause this video in a few minutes because I have to go and do something and then I'll come back. But anyway, so the formula is basically to try and understand where your emotions are coming from is to go and look at your life, because I believe that we're supposed to honor the partnership between our souls and the souls of others as expressions of God, as creations of God. And actually, I believe we're fractals of God, and I talked about that elsewhere. If that doesn't make sense to you, I talked about that elsewhere, and I'll link it below. But we want to start connecting with others as well as with ourselves, right? And to do that, I think a very beautiful way to start valuing our emotions in this way to make ourselves more loving, or to connect more with our soul and its inherent loving nature, we can look at our own experiences and try to understand, based on our own experiences, how negative or positive we think we should be. Not based on, oh, well, law of attraction tells me that I need to be more positive than negative, so I'm going to be more positive than negative. And not, oh, well, law of assumption tells me that I need to be certain and I need to live as though it has already happened. And I talked about all the ethical issues with that and why I don't agree with that approach. I especially don't agree with doing it a lot. I mean, if you want to do it every now and then, it's probably fine. But yeah, I don't think it's good to do it a lot. So anyway, so you want to start anchoring into that heart communication as emotional communication. And I'm going to go ahead and pause the video, but I'll be back in a few seconds for y'all, but I have to go. So anyway, it'll be a few seconds for y'all and like a few hours for me. Okay, thank you. Okay, so it's the next day, July 25th and 2025, July 25th, 2025. And sorry, my voice is bothering me a bit this morning, so just bear with me, please. But, okay, so basically, I want to talk about, I want to continue what I was trying to get to yesterday before I had to pause. And so I want to talk about something that I think can help people, like I said, something that I think can help people who have been maybe toxically positive. And when I say toxically positive, I'm not talking, a teeny tiny bit too positive. I'm talking like again, it's toxic positivity. So it's way too positive or way too emotionally suppressive. We're human. We might emotionally suppress a little bit more than we're supposed to. We make mistakes, but this isn't a little sprinkling of emotional suppression. This is massive emotional suppression that I see within law of assumption, law of attraction, and even law of detachment. Again, I'm not saying people can't do a little bit of law of detachment, but law of detachment, especially in the spiritual woo-woo new age communities, has really gone way overboard and has become not a healthy balance of detachment and not a healthy balance of detachment and attachment. Instead, it's become really a loss of your humanity, a loss of your soul's influence through its emotions and through its natural attachment to things, right? Because again, law of detachment should not be barely being attached. It should be a healthy balance between attachment and detachment, depending on the situation. There's some things we're supposed to be 10% attached to on the divine path, the highest divine path for our soul's existence this lifetime. There's some things we're supposed to be 10% attached to, and some things we're supposed to be 90% attached to. Okay, so, but what's happening is I feel like a lot of people are going 90% detached or 95% detached, and it's too detached, which that's the trend in general within spirituality. I feel like these days, especially within manifesting. I've talked about the problems with manifesting, and anyway, it's become I'm talking about this in the video that I'm going to put up, that I haven't quite finished, but it's become the spiritual new age woo-woo communities, when it comes to manifesting, like law of attraction, law of assumption, law of detachment, have become very, I say this over and over, I feel like I'm not able to articulate it the way I want to right now, but emotionally sterilized, right? Maybe because I'm talking about it elsewhere, I have to remind myself I don't need to go into all this detail about things I've already talked about. So anyway, okay, so, well, I've talked about and I'm going to post soon. So anyway, moving on to what I need to talk about, though, today, I think, is that there is a potential solution for a lot of people who suspect that they've been either super toxically positive, which if you've been doing a lot of law of attraction, a lot of law of assumption, a lot of law of detachment, there's a very good chance you've been very toxically positive, aka emotionally sterilized. Or if you've been on the other end, you've been toxically negative, which toxic negativity can be a form of emotional sterilization as well. I just feel like there's less of a trend to that right now. But even toxic negativity can be emotionally sterilizing. But anyway, because the point is it's heavy devaluing of your emotional communication. But the issue with toxic positivity is that there's this idea that if you're super positive, or you get rid of doubt, or you heavily, heavily disconnect from doubt, there's this idea that, that's going to attract these outcomes that you want in your life, which I believe is very untrue. I think it works, but it's not ethical that it works. And I talked about this elsewhere, and I need to continue with what I was talking about with the formula. But I want to say this part. Just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? Just because you can rob a bank to make, money, or just because you can rob someone to make money doesn't mean you should, right? So the emphasis here needs to be just because you can attract abundance into your life through emotional suppression, and I would argue emotional sterilization, it doesn't mean that you should, right? What a wild concept. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. So anyway, okay. But on to the point of what I was trying to say, which is the formula. So we can use our minds to try to understand where our hurt's coming from. And not just our minds to understand where our heart's coming from, but we can anchor into the divinely led aspect of our mind, right? and the heart, of course, as well. So anyway, to do that, we can, there's this formula that I want to suggest. So you don't have to do this. In fact, I personally plan on doing this in a couple months. I don't plan on doing this now because I'm already I'm a very emotional person, so I don't feel like, I'm trying to think of how to explain this. I'm not like perfect emotionally, but I would consider myself fairly healthy emotionally. I deeply value negative emotions alongside positive emotions. That's what I consider to be really a huge foundation of emotional health. And if you're someone who resents your positive emotions, or you're someone who resents your negative emotions, or believes that your negative emotions are going to block you just by being negative emotions, then you're probably not anything close to emotionally healthy. And it's not necessarily your fault, right? Because again, there are all these trends to do this in our society, and the spiritual community has become very obviously corrupted in this way. And so there's this trend to, I think, disconnect you from your soul's communication. I think that's a big part of why law of assumption, law of detachment, law of attraction have gotten super unhealthy. And personally, I think law of assumption is unhealthy by nature, but I don't think law of detachment is unhealthy by nature, but I think it's become unhealthy. But anyway, so I'm digressing. But yeah, so if you think that you've become super unhealthy emotionally, and you're trying to develop respect for your emotional communication again, whether it be your negative or positive emotions, or both. Maybe you're just kind of neither here nor there, barely, one way or the other. And you just feel like you don't really tap into your emotions much at all. Then this is another good place to start, in my opinion. And so, okay, so the formula. I want us to look at, because this is what I think we can do. So basically, we can look at so we have an ego, right? And so we think of our lens first. That's just part of being human. You're going to see things from your own lens, right? And so you have your relationship with yourself, then you have your relationship with others in your life. And some people in your life are closer to you than others. However, when I say others in your life, I mean people other than your own self, right? Now, you're connected to others in a divine way, but I mean like your soul, like your connection with your soul, your lens is one. And then you have connection with others, right? And so that's two. So it's you and the scope of the world. Now, it doesn't have to be 50-50, right? I think depending on the person, some people one might need to be 50%, the other might need to be 50. For someone else, their lens might need to be 25%, and the scope of the world might need to be 75%. It depends, right? And this isn't perfect because, again, how do you quantify all of God's creation, right? But I think that this is a good place to start. So this is why I'm suggesting it. Okay. You look at your own life and you look at your own experience. And you look at it as one lens, and then you look at the greater scope of the world and you look at that as another lens, where you're trying to care about your own concerns along with the concerns of others in your life and within society in general. And for you, this might be literally your life and then everyone else. Or it might be your lens is your life and people closely connected to you in your life might be one lens. And then the other lens is the greater scope of the world, right? You get to kind of decide what feels healthy in that way, or what you're called to in that way. But the point is, you want to connect to not only your personal lens, but you want to very heavily factor in others in your life and the greater scope of the world. So you want to look at the suffering you've experienced and the joy you've experienced. And you also want to look at the world and those in your life and kind of get an idea for how much should I be happy based on this and how much should I be sad based on this. And so when you do that, I'm going to pause the video because it's been 11 minutes, but it'll be a few seconds for y'all and a few minutes for me. Thank you. Okay, so you want to find a healthy balance between valuing your own lens and the lens, your perspective on others in your life, in this world, even in creation itself. To try and get a better picture of where you want to be in terms of your positive negative spectrum when it comes to your emotions. And again, I'm not trying. I understand that like emotions aren't just simple math, right? But that being said, I think again, to try and get better perspective, we can use our minds in this way. And so I think it can be helpful. But for myself, I think I was kind of mentioning this, but I didn't go into a lot of detail, but I don't plan on doing this for a couple months for myself, because I'm more in that I'm already a very emotional person, and I consider myself to be fairly emotionally healthy. Am I perfect? No, but I'm already very emotionally tapped in. I deeply value my negative and my positive emotions. But even I can still benefit from this. It's just I want to have a little more time just being with my emotions and not trying to quantify them. But if you're already very in the mental state of like mentally controlling your emotions and like being very blocked from your negative or your positive emotions, which again, if you are in the spiritual community and you're doing a lot of manifesting practices, there's a very good chance that you are emotionally suppressing very heavily, emotionally suppressing your negative emotions. And then on the flip side, if you're someone who's like constantly watching the news and like, you know, just complaining about people in your life and everything's wrong and all this stuff, you're probably way too negative and you're forcing yourself to be negative. Realistically, you're forcing yourself with your mind to be very negative. But again, a lot of spiritual people are forcing themselves with their mind to be way too positive, okay? Or to, at the very least, they're forcing themselves to detach from their negative emotions, very heavily detach from their negative emotions. And I don't think that's healthy to do that. So anyway, but I think a lot of people would benefit from, whether they do it, you know, in a week or they do it in 2 months or whatever, I think a lot of people would benefit from using this formula. So, especially if you've been super duper positive, right? Especially if you've been in the spiritual community and doing like lots of law of attraction, lots of law of assumption, and or lots of law of attraction, and or lots of law of assumption, you would probably benefit a lot from doing this sooner rather than later, okay? Using this formula sooner rather than later. So you want to try and understand, with that perspective, you want to factor in your own lens and people in your life and the greater scope of the world. Another way you can do it, you don't even have to do it with 2, you could do it with 3. You could do your own personal life, the lives of those you're closest to, and then the general scope of the world. That would be another way you could do it. But you want them to all have a very high place. They don't have to necessarily be equal in this context. I think they're supposed to be equal in the sense that we're all equal to God. However, from my understanding, let's say you're someone who's been factoring others' opinions in too much and barely focusing on your own soul's guidance and your own desires, you might want to put a little more emphasis on yourself, right? But if you have been someone who's on the flip end, who's like, let's say you're someone who's like is constantly thinking about yourself and barely thinking about others, then you're going to probably want to put a lot less emphasis on yourself. That's my opinion. Okay, so let's say you're factoring it in as two. So you have just your lens and the lens of others. You would probably want to be somewhere between 25 and 75% of one lens or the other. So I'm trying to think of how to explain this. So let's say you think that you are way too focused on yourself. Or you get to a place where you start to suspect that you're way too focused on yourself. Then it probably would be good to go somewhere between 25 to 50% focus on yourself. But if you're someone who thinks that you don't focus on yourself nearly enough, you tend to worry a lot about other people, but you don't really go after what you want. You tend to put yourself close to last, that sort of thing. Then it's probably a good idea for you to be somewhere between 50 and 75% focused on yourself. And so anyway, so somewhere between 25 and 75 focus on yourself, and somewhere between 25% focus on others. Now, if you're doing it with three categories, I'm trying to think of how to do the math on that, because I only thought about three like in the last few minutes in talking, and literally in this recording in the last few minutes. So I guess what you would do is, like, if you suspect that you're focusing, again, like if you suspect that you're focusing way too little on yourself, you might make your lens be 50% or 55%, maybe 70, but 70 is pushing it. If you get to 70, you're probably, it's starting to get, like, it might be a little too high. I'm not saying it's too high in every situation. I just think there's a good chance that it's too high. So, especially if you get, like, to 75, that's really the highest I'd be comfortable with. Once you get to 80, I think it's way too high. But let's say you land at 70. I'm not telling you there's not an excuse for landing at 70. So let's say you land at 70. You land at 70, you're 70%, your lens is 70%. Maybe the people in your life are 17% and the world is 13%, right? Because if you're real with yourself, you're going to focus more on people directly in your life, a lot closer to you in your life, realistically, than people you don't know that you hear about, on social media or whatever. Or, oh, I know that there's this thing going on in this part of the world. Like, it hurts you, you're sad about it if there's suffering going on in other parts of the world, but it's not going to hit you the same way realistically that it would if it's someone you know personally, right? So let's say you make people in your life be 17%. So you're 70%, people in your life are 17, and then the greater scope of the world is 13, and that makes 100. Now, 70% is pushing it. So I was intentionally doing about as high as I think is acceptable for your personal lens, just to give you an idea of how to do the math on that. But personally, I would say it needs to be closer to 50. I think it's healthy to have it be close to 50. And even if you're dividing by 3, I still think it's healthy to do close to 50, because when you think of it, people close to you in your life, they heavily infuse your lens. They're like a blend between your lens and the part of the world that you're not as closely connected to, if that makes sense. They're like a midway point. So it's some of their lens is going to go into your personal lens, and some of their lens is going to go into the greater scope of the world, if that makes sense. And it all kind of blends together. I mean, even your lens is going to be swayed by the other aspects of the world, right? What I'm trying to do is get greater perspective, and to help you get greater perspective too. And so I guess a way to look at it, I was thinking of this like 20 minutes ago. A way to look at this might be like thinking of it kind of like tea leaves. So you have like your lens, right? Think of it like water. And then think of tea leaves like others in your life, whether it's the greater scope of the world or it's, split into people directly in your life and people in the greater scope of the world. They're the tea leaves in this analogy. And you've already infused your lens heavily with tea leaves. One, you've already got a lot of, tea infusion in the water itself. It's already started to become tea, herbal tea or whatever it is, right? And you're still going to have tea leaves. Like, even if you try and separate your own lens, it's going to be heavily influenced still by others in your life. That's kind of the point. You're supposed to be connected to others as expressions of God. It's not just, we're not just supposed to be a bunch of ping pong balls bouncing around, and then the moment we connect, we separate. Like, that's not how we're supposed to be, right? Even though a lot of spiritual people act like that's what you're supposed to be with their emotional suppression, emotional sterilization. But anyway, So if we think of others kind of like tea leaves, and we're the water, right? And so that's the infusion. Our lens is the water, the lens of others, and what others are going through, and trying to sympathize with them or empathize with them, however you want to look at it, sympathy versus empathy, but that sympathy or whatever it is, and trying to understand the perspectives of others, and that influencing your own perspective, your own water, and becoming a tea infusion. One, when you try to separate it, you already have the tea infusion in the water. So even if you take the leaves out, you're still going to have elements of the leaves already in the water, right? But two, you don't even want to fully take the leaves out. It's more like you want to just suspend it less in the water. So maybe you had the sachet, let's say it's a sachet of a tea sachet, or a tea pouch, or whatever you want to call it, tea bag. Instead of having it fully submerged in the water, maybe you have it 1/3 submerged in the water, right? So I'm telling you, like, to get perspective, and the way that I'm asking that you get perspective, and I think it's kind of like lifting the tea bag out of the water. Not 100% lifting it out, but heavily lifting it out so you get greater perspective. So anyway, you want to look at your life and the lives of others in this world. Maybe even if you believe in life outside of this earth, maybe try to understand or imagine what it's like in other parts of God's creation, even though that's going to be very scattered and confusing, so you don't have to do that. But just try to understand, within creation itself, kind of different degrees of connection to yourself, and to get a general idea of how positive or negative you should be based off of that. So maybe, and I'm going to pause the video again because it's been 12 minutes. Okay, so I'm inside, so it might sound a little different in here, but it was just getting too hot outside, in my opinion. So anyway, so even if you were to do 33, 33, 34, whatever, 33.3, and then times 3, if you were to have the 3 lenses, or if you to have the 2, even if it were 50-50, you get to kind of decide, try to understand, if you believe in God or the divine, ask God or the divine for assistance in that, and try to just land where it feels right in a divinely led way. And so let's say you decide that you're going to be, 45% focused on your own lens, and then 55% the combination of others in the rest of creation, or whatever it ends up being. I don't know what's right. I'm still trying to figure out for myself. I don't even know. It's like, because how do you quantify that, right? Are we even supposed to? But at the same time, I think trying to get a better idea and trying to quantify a little bit can help us. But at the same time, we don't want to be too focused on the numbers, because at some point it's like, the numbers aren't everything, right? And are we even supposed to really understand how to quantify that on a large level? Probably not. Okay. It's kind of like trying to be 100% mental. It's not healthy to be 100% mental, right? But if we, try to be in union with a divinely led heart and a divinely led mind, then I think that's going to, and there are other elements of the soul, not just the heart, not just the mind, but the mind and the heart are a huge part of that. So trying to find a healthy balance between the heart and the mind is kind of like finding a healthy balance between numbers and pragmatic approaches and technical approaches, and then more intuitive flow. And so the numbers would be more the mental pragmatic, right? And so anyway, so trying to look at it, and again, it doesn't have to be 50-50. None of this has to be 50-50. Including your mind-heart connection doesn't have to be 50-50. Maybe you're more in the divine feminine. I consider myself to be more in the divine feminine energy, whether I am or not. And so, I'm not telling you to be 50-50 there either, right? You could be 80-20 or whatever it is, 70-30, right? But anyway, so going back to the numbers when it comes to the tea sachet or the tea bag in the water and the tea infusion. So trying to get perspective, right? So let's say you land at 45% focus. Let's say 40% focus on yourself. You land at 40% focus on yourself, 35% focus on people in your life, 25% focus on the greater scope of the world. Let's say you land there. And that makes the 100. And God is part of the greater scope, but he is connected to everything. So it's kind of like, I don't know. I don't look at him as a separate thing. I look at him as like the umbrella. But anyway, so I believe there's a divine mother energy and a divine father energy. So please understand that when I'm saying him. I'm just saying him because I'm used to saying him. But anyway, okay. So, but I'm digressing too much, I think. So anyway, let me try to get back to what I was trying to say. Because again, this is what happens. I digress. My mind goes off on tangents. I get scattered and I want to explain all these things at once. And it's just, yeah. Okay. So, but anyway, so you have that, let's say you land at 40% focus on yourself, 35% focus on those in your life, and 25% focus on the greater scope of the world. That would be, and God's creation in general, the greater scope of God's creation. Then that would be, where was I trying to go? Oh, okay. So you average that out. So let's say that you look at your own life and you feel like you should be, let's just say you feel like you should be 50% happy, 50% sad. By the way, I don't believe that you have to be more happy or sad. I don't believe that you have to be more happy to attract abundance into your life. I think it works, but it's an example of just because you can doesn't mean you should. It's kind of like I was saying earlier, just because you can rob someone to get money doesn't mean you should do that. Just because you can exploit your emotions to attract abundance doesn't mean you should. And I've talked about this and why it's actually why emotional exploitation is leading to financial abundance. I've talked about that in another video. So anyway, and I'll link that video below. But anyway, it's a video I haven't posted yet, but by the time I post this, then I imagine that will be up already. So anyway, okay. I feel like I need to kind of center a little bit because I'm getting very scattered right now. Okay. So yeah, this is a part where I'm like, I need to ask God for help because I am going way off kind of into the ether at this point, I feel like. Okay. So basically, so you have this point where you're focused on the greater scope. So it's your own lens, people in your life, the greater scope of the world, right? Even maybe the greater scope of creation. And you're going to want to try to understand, looking at your own life, how happy or sad you need to be. And let's say you land 50-50. Okay, then it would be, let's say, so you do the math. So let's say you think you're supposed to be 40% focused on yourself. So you take 40% of 50%, which would be 20%. In the whole, it would be 20% positive, 20% negative, right? And then let's say and I don't feel like doing this other math in my head, but let's say you land at 35% focus on others in your life. Is that what I think that's what I did. Yeah. Okay. So 35% focus on others in your life. So that would be 35%. And let's say you were just to look at it as 50% happy, 50% sad for everything, to keep the math simple. I don't think that's how it usually works. I don't think it's 50-50 in most situations. Well, let's just say it's 50-50. Then it would literally be 50% of 35% is 17.5, 50% of 25% is going to be 12.5, and you add it all up and go figure it's 50% of 100, so it's 50. So 50% positive, 50% negative. That's just so that I cannot have to get all crazy with the math in this recording, but it's probably not going to be that simple, right? It's probably going to be something like, you suspect that you're 40%, it's supposed to be 40% focus on yourself, and it's 20, and you think that you're supposed to be 70% happy and 30% sad, or whatever it is. 70% positive emotions, 30% negative emotions. So you take 30% negative of the 40%, that's going to be 12% negative and 28% positive for your own lens. And then you do the same for the scope of the world. So if you look at the world and you're like 70-30, then okay. And it might not all be the same. It might not be 70-30 for every category, right? But you want to kind of look at the general numbers there, and you want to do the math. Okay, and obviously you're probably going to need a calculator. Like I would need a calculator for anything that had a decimal in it. Okay, so anyway, so where was I going to go? Okay, but then there's another element here. So you could do it that simply and leave it at that. And I think that would probably be okay for a lot of people, but I think a lot of people are going to want to take it a step further. And I think it would be helpful for a lot of people to take it a step further. So just like you want to assess, I think you want to assess like your lens of others, and I'm not very concise. I apologize. It's hard for me to be concise when I'm talking about these things, and I get in my head and I want to explain it well, and then I get scattered. So anyway, but like it's easier for me to talk about this when I'm just thinking about it, talking, like thinking out loud. But when I come on the recording, it's just, I don't know, there's more pressure. And so it feels like there's more pressure, and there is probably more pressure. So anyway, it doesn't come out as well as I want it to. But anyway, so, okay, so then hope. So you want to factor in hope. So hope is going to sway your lens. And I'm going to go into hope in the next recording because it's been 10 minutes. So it'll be a few seconds for y'all, a few minutes for me. Thank you. Okay, so back outside. And just to make it clear, I said this before, but I want to reiterate, not everything is going to be exactly the same in each category. So let's say you just have two categories, and you're looking at as just your lens and the lens of others in general. Or if it's your lens, the lens of others more directly in your life, and the lens of those, in the greater scope of the world, regardless of how you look at it, because again, like I was saying before, the lens of those more directly in your life, oftentimes they're so close to you that they permeate your lens very heavily anyway, right? So I think it could go either way. It could be two lenses or three. But the point is that, and technically there's a fourth lens. It's the God lens, the divine lens, or a third lens, depending on how many lenses. But there's a divine lens as well. But that is more complicated to talk about here, so I don't really feel like going into that as much. So I think what needs to happen is you're using your divine lens to shape your choice to look at these different lenses, if that makes sense. I hope I'm not being too complicated. But this is a complicated thing to talk about to understand the kind of larger perspective, but it's to get to a more simplified understanding of how to operate, if that makes sense. And I hope that's what's happening, because that's why I'm trying to talk about this. So anyway, so not every category has to be the same, right? Maybe, like I said, maybe for myself, it would be, let's say, 70% positive, 30% negative. And then the general scope of the world, maybe it's closer to 50-50, right? Not everything is going to be the same in each category necessarily. Maybe it is, but realistically, it's probably not, in my opinion, going to be the same. It might be very close, maybe even just like 5% difference, but it's still probably not going to be identical, right? So anyway, okay, so back to hope. So hope is a huge part of, okay, so basically, when you believe in the divine, you tend to have a lot of hope, which is why law of attraction is partially true, but there's a lot of corruption in law of attraction, and I've talked about that elsewhere, and I'll link that below as well. I'll try to remember to. I talked about it largely in the video, Manifesting is Probably Making You Cold-Hearted and Emotionally Numb. In that video, I went into a lot of description about that. And I generally referred to it as manifesting, but I was really specifically talking about law of attraction. Okay, so anyway, but when you believe in the divine, you tend to lean into hope, because belief in the divine, belief is leaning into belief in a greater power, serving love. But it's also belief in the continuation of the soul and that there's something more, whether you believe in reincarnation or just going to heaven or both. I believe in both. But it tends to give you greater perspective. And so when you believe in the divine, you tend to, in my opinion, lean into hope in general. Now, are you going to have times when your belief in the divine is going to make you lose hope? Probably. Probably when you question why bad things happen, you'll start to question God, and you might, lean negative in those situations. But in general, averaged out, I think belief in the divine is going to make you more hopeful, right? And that's going to help you lean positive, help you be a little more on the positive end of the spectrum. But again, there are ebbs and flows emotionally, and so you don't want to be like thinking, oh, I need to be positive all the time. You don't, okay? You don't need to be, in my opinion, you do not need to be positive all the time. And also, when we are thinking so much like, oh, I need to be positive, oh, I need to be positive, oh, I need to be positive, oh, I need to be positive. Well, the problem with that is that maybe technically you need to be 55% positive, 45% negative. Let's just say you need to be 55% positive, 45% negative. Well, when you're putting so much emphasis on positivity, you're probably not landing 55-45. You're probably going to be landing 80-20 or 90-10, maybe even 95-5, maybe even 99-1, when you're supposed to be landing 55-45, as an example. There's a huge difference there. And so a lot of people, and I kind of think most people doing law of attraction, especially when they do a lot of law of attraction, that's what ends up happening. They're telling themselves, oh, I need to be more positive. I need to be more positive. And they do it in a very unhealthy way because they're vilifying their negative emotions oftentimes. And that's part of why I'm trying to explain this, is because it relates to the conversation on how do you find a healthy balance. And so that's what I'm trying to offer with this formula, and it's not a precise formula, right? You kind of get to decide for yourself what numbers you attach to it. But anyway, to the formula, what numbers you attach to the formula. So, hope. You tend to lean, in my opinion, when you believe in the divine, you tend to lean into hope very heavily. Or you tend, not necessarily very heavily, but oftentimes you lean into hope. That's what I mean to say. Even if it's 55-45, you're still leaning into hope, right? You're still more on the positive end than the negative end of the spectrum emotionally. In my opinion, most people who believe in the divine, when you average out the number of years they believe in the divine and a certain incarnation such as this, I do think that they tend to be more positive than negative. But again, like I said, you don't want to do that. Approach it as this, oh, I need to always be more positive. Like that's nonsense, and I don't think it's healthy, which is why so many people doing law of attraction are very emotionally unhealthy. And in fact, law of attraction, the foundation of law of attraction is the idea that you have to be more positive and negative. More I'm slurring my words because I get ahead of myself and I like jump before I finish the syllable. The foundation of law of attraction is the belief that you have to be more positive than negative. And personally, I believe that is, like I said, nonsense. I want to say another word, but I'm trying to make this acceptable for even children to listen to, which is why I'm being careful about my verbiage. But anyway, I think that it is nonsense, right? I don't think it is fair to say that that you have to be more positive than negative. I don't think it is that simple. And I talked about that in the other video I think it's called Manifesting is Probably Making You Cold-Hearted and Emotionally Numb. Okay, so anyway, so back to hope. So when you believe in hope, that's going to shape your lens, and it can be very confusing because it's like, when you believe in hope or when you lean into hope, you are likely to, at least in my experience, I found myself to disconnect a little bit too much from my present moment emotions, like where I'm not being influenced enough by my past or by my present moment, and I'm being influenced too much by my future. Again, this isn't you need to be in the present moment all the time thing. Because again, the spiritual community, they focus so much on the present moment and they forget the value of the past and the future. And I talked about that in my video called, it's something about melancholy, like the role of melancholy and emotional depth. I talked about that a lot in that video, about the problem with presence in the spiritual community and where that's gotten very toxic. Because in general, the spiritual community has gotten very toxic, but it's not just the spiritual community. I mean, there's definitely toxicity in and emotional suppression in religion. It's just, I feel like the trend is like where, there are problems with it in religion. It's like the difference between driving 50 miles an hour and 1,000 miles an hour. It's like the spiritual community is going 1,000 miles an hour in the wrong direction. That's how it feels to me. A lot of the spiritual community right now is like going 1,000 miles an hour in the wrong direction. It's horrifying. So anyway, I think it's horrifying. So, okay. So hope. It's been 9 minutes and this is going to be a long-ish part of the recording. So I'm going to pause it and come right back. A few seconds for y'all, a few minutes for me. Thank you. All right, so I'm back inside because there was a bug that wouldn't leave me alone. So I decided to just come back inside. So I don't know. I like to say that because I've talked in another video about why I like to say where I am inside versus outside, but also because the sound changes and I don't know, I feel like I need to acknowledge that. But anyway, okay, so I'm back inside and hope. So with hope, basically, and it's harder for me to think when I'm inside in general. And so I always get a little nervous when I'm inside doing the recordings because my concentration diminishes. And I already have enough issues with concentration when I'm outside. So it's even harder for me to concentrate when I'm inside in general. Okay. So hope. So hope influences our lens. So a way to understand this, I think, is like kind of like with the tea bag analogy or the tea sachet analogy with others, where you like take the tea bag out, not fully, but it's like it's less submerged in the water, and so there's less of an infusion taking place temporarily, and then eventually you put the tea bag back in. It's kind of like that with hope as well. So So basically, you would want to, I think that you would want to, like, look at your life. This is how I plan on doing it, and I think a lot of people would benefit from this approach. You look at your life, and you think, based on, my life and, issues in society and just the greater scope of God's creation, where is hope helpful? Like, what amount of hope is helpful, and what amount of hope ends up doing more damage? Because there's a place where hope can become too saturated and you lose connection. I'm trying to think of how to explain this. Like, is your hope making you more loving, or is it making you less loving? And there's a place where hope, or our understanding of hope anyway, maybe hope's not bad inherently. I don't think, this is complicated. I'm trying to think of how to explain this. Hope is not bad. Obviously, hope is beautiful and wonderful and can be very divinely led a lot of the time. Just like positivity can be very divinely led a lot of the time. But there can become a point where your positivity is forced and then suppresses your negative emotions that are divinely led, which is what's happening a lot in the spiritual community and elsewhere, but it's happening a bunch in the spiritual community. Well, the same thing kind of happened. The same approach is kind of used with hope for a lot of people. Like, they'll focus so much on hope in the divine and hope in the afterlife and hope in their future without really recognizing the pain that needs to be felt and honored that they've experienced or are experiencing or might still experience. And frankly, in a world of suffering, you're probably going to still experience pain. I mean, it's almost a given. But I believe that when you are operating from a deeply loving place, sooner rather than later, God's going to step in and bring a lot more joy into your life because he wants to reward you and encourage you. One, he wants to encourage you through rewarding you for being a loving person. But two, he understands that it's way too much suffering for most people, even, if you look at it from a divine justice or a divine consequence standpoint, most people are still suffering more than they ever deserved, right? Even like beyond the scope of, okay, here's a lesson, and suffering can serve a little bit of a lesson or an initiation. It can be a little bit of an initiation as well. Like, there's a point where it's like that suffering is not even the suffering God wanted us to experience to learn a lesson. Like, it's been taken way, like, the level of suffering that a lot of us are experiencing is way more than God ever wanted us to really experience, in my opinion, to learn a lesson. So anyway, so I'm not trying to glorify pain, y'all. I'm just, again, balance, and it's a nuanced issue. Okay, so hope can greatly impact us, right? But it can influence us on our lens very heavily. And so we believe in the divine. So, of course, if you believe in the divine, and I believe in the divine, I believe in God, then I have a lot of hope. But I don't want my hope to be like, I don't want my hope to be kind of the snake that eats its tail. I don't want my hope to become toxic positivity suppressing negative emotions, right? Because they're all, like, negative and positive emotions can be divinely led, right? Anger, sadness, loneliness, confusion, doubt, fear, those can be divinely led, just like joy, faith, peace, etc. can be divinely led, in my opinion. So, what I think is helpful is to try and imagine, like, obviously, hope isn't going to be completely detached from you, and you don't want it to be, because hope is a beautiful part of our soul's communication and our soul's experience. But because oftentimes when we think of hope, we tend to lean way too far into the toxic positivity end of the spectrum. I think it's good to try to detach a little bit temporarily from hope to try to get greater perspective. And so I want you to imagine a world where you didn't believe in God. Imagine a world where you didn't believe that there's an afterlife. Imagine a world where you didn't believe in the divine. Imagine being an atheist in this world, right? I don't know if you have any atheist friends. I don't think I've had any atheist friends since I was like in college. And they weren't even friends. It was like a roommate that was atheist, I think. That was it. So, I don't know a lot of atheists. And if I do, well, actually, I do. I forgot. There is one atheist I know pretty well. But he doesn't talk about atheism very much, so I almost forgot. But anyway, I haven't been around a lot of people who are like obviously atheists and constantly talked about their atheism. But anyway, so I'm trying to think of how to explain this. So almost you'd want to imagine almost being an atheist in this world. And how sad versus happy would you be looking at your past, present, and future and what you imagine your future to hold? How optimistic would you be, right? And then look at issues in the world. How optimistic would you be, in the greater scope of the world? And so if you average that out, so let's say you take your lens and you're like, okay, let's say you're doing it divided by 2. So it's your lens and the greater scope of the world. And let's say that you want to put, just to keep the math simple, again, I don't think most people are going to be 50-50, but for the sake of keeping simple math for this recording, let's say it's 50-50. So let's say you're 50, it's 50% your lens, 50% the greater scope of the world. And you believe that if you did not believe in the divine, if you were atheist, you would be, let's say, 70% positive, 30% negative. And so that would be 70%, 30% of the 50% I'm sorry, I keep having to clear my throat. Just a moment. I don't want you to hear me clearing my throat too much. So I'm going to pause the video. Okay, so, and please don't mind, I don't know if y'all can hear it, but there's yard work or something going on in the neighborhood, and it's kind of loud to me anyway, but I don't know if y'all can hear it. But okay, so imagining that, if you decide that you think 50% of the lens is your lens, 50% is the greater scope of the world, okay, so 50-50. And again, I'm not asking you to, quantify life. What I'm doing is I'm asking you to use your mental, use your mind, as we have been taught, and our society has put so much emphasis on the mind, and really the ego. The ego's attachment to the mind. The ego, pulling the mind very heavily. Because we're so mentally trained in our society, I'm trying to help us use our minds to understand the divine, not only through our divinely led mind, but also using our divinely led mind to understand the heart, and where the heart's coming from. And so anyway, I don't know how to quantify these things. I'm not trying to do perfect math here. I'm not trying to be like, oh yeah, you need to decide that you're 43% and then other people are 60 or 57%, or that's not what I'm doing. What I'm doing is just trying to get us to start thinking about how much would you quantify your experience in your lens so that you start prioritizing your lens alongside others. Whether you've been paying too much attention to your own lens and not enough attention to the lens of others, or vice versa, maybe you've been paying way too much attention to the lens of others, not enough to your own lens. Or maybe you've just been kind of floating in the ether and not really paying attention to much of anything, right? So anyway, that's why I'm trying to use these numbers. So please don't I don't know. I don't want this to be taken out of context. But anyway, okay. So 50% my lens as an example, keeping the math simple. Let's say it's 50% my lens, 50% the greater scope of the world. And then again, 70%, like I think that as an example, I personally don't know what I think for myself when it comes to these numbers yet. So this is just an example. This isn't literally how I feel about what my numbers would be. But let's say I decide that I feel like I'm supposed to be about 70% positive, 30% negative based on my experience. And then again, let's say, so that's 35. Okay, so I don't need to overcomplicate this. So 70% positive for the 50%, 30 for my 50%, right? And then for the greater scope of the world, let's say you look at the world and you're like, I feel like it's 50-50. Let's just say you feel like it's 50-50. Then averaged out, if they're both equal value, 50%, 50%, then averaged out, it's 60% positive as the medium between 50% and 70%. Another way to look at that would be what is 70% of 50%? That is 35%. And then what is 60% of, I'm sorry, wait, just bear with me. I'm getting confused because I didn't have this written down, so I'm just basing it off of memory. Okay, so 50% of 70%, that's 35%. And then let's say 50% of the 60%, it was 50% of 50, that's what it was. 50% of 50% positive for the greater scope of the world would be 25%. You add those up, 25 plus 35 is going to be 60. Also, because you're dealing with 50%, so it's easier to do the math in this. Again, you could also just say literally, what is the in between? What is the average between 70 and 50? That's going to be 60. But anyway, if they're not equal value, that's where you might want to bring a calculator into it. When it's equal value, you probably don't need to bring a calculator into it. But if it's not equal value, then you're likely going to need to bring a calculator into it, unless you're good at doing head math. But anyway, okay, so that's just kind of getting general perspective. So from that lens, or from that combination of lenses, when I'm trying to understand the greater scope alongside my lens or with my lens, that is about 60% positive based on that. I would think, okay, without hope, without belief in the divine greatly adding to my levels of hope, then I would land at, as an example, 60%. Then the divine's going to probably add somewhere between 25 and 75%. And the reason I say that is because I don't want to think that belief in God just gets us to 100. I don't think it's healthy to view it that way personally, because what happens is, let's say you believe in the divine and you're like, oh, well, I believe in the divine, so I'm not going to be sad at all. And it's like, but you need to honor the sadness that you naturally feel in response to a world of suffering. And I've talked about this in multiple videos. But you need to honor, in my opinion, you need to honor the sadness that you naturally feel in response to suffering to be the loving person that is going to create a loving world for God. So I think it would be really silly to be like, oh, I believe in God, therefore I'm going to be 100% happy. Like, that wouldn't be healthy, right? So what I think is good personally is to go, again, somewhere between 25-75% addition. So let's say you land at 60% positive in the greater scope of the world, when you don't really think, like, when you're trying to imagine what it would be like to not believe in God. And again, if you believe in God, you're not going to fully detach from your belief in God to understand this, right? But you're just kind of trying to get a general idea, again, for perspective. So again, 60%. Then let's say you decide that you're going to bridge the gap 25%. You feel like God, to create the loving world, you want to bridge the gap 25%. So that's going to be 25% of the 40% difference is, again, this is more simple math because of, this is more simple math, so I don't need to do this in a calculator, but 25% of the 40% difference, that's 10% added to 60% and 70%. If it were 50% of the 40% difference, then it'd be 20% added to 60 is 80%. So let's say it's 25% additional positivity because I believe in God, then that would land me at about 70% positive. If I believe that it's going to be 50% additional positivity, then that would land me around 20% added to the 60% is 80%. If I believe that it's 75% of the 40%, then that would be 30% added to 60. That's going to be 90% positive. Personally, I don't think it's healthy to be more than 90% positive, and I stand by this. I don't think it's healthy in general in our world to be more than 90% positive, y'all. And I absolutely, I would say I stand by this because there is so much suffering in this world. We need to allow ourselves to deeply honor the sadness that we naturally feel in response to suffering to create that loving world. And I talked about this in a video that I'm going to put out later that I've already talked about in here that's not quite finished. And I also talked about this in the video on the vilification of fear in the spiritual community. And I think that I talked about, I'm almost positive I talked about it in the video on manifesting, I think it's manifesting is probably making you cold-hearted and emotionally numb. So I talked about it in there, I'm pretty sure. But I'll explain it really quickly here. Again, for me, quick. I don't know if it's quick in the grand scheme. But anyway, I don't think it's going to take more than 5 to 10 minutes to explain this part, knock on wood. But, okay, so in a world of suffering, we naturally are supposed to feel quite a bit of sadness. And I explain this to try and make sense of this because I don't think I explained this in this video, but I like to explain this in videos where I talk about this sort of stuff, so I'm going to explain it now. And actually, I'm going to pause the video again because it's been 10 minutes, but it'll be a few seconds for y'all and a few minutes for me. Thank you. Okay, so I believe that love is the essence of God. And I believe that we are connected to God even in our physical incarnations. I believe that our soul is connected to God. I've heard that there is a, I don't think I've explained this part exactly, but I've heard that there is a cord that connects you to your physical incarnation, and that when you die, that cord is broken. But I believe there's kind of a cord that connects you, almost like an umbilical cord, connecting you to God on a soul level. And in that umbilical cord, and I haven't heard anyone else say this part that I've said about love. So this isn't the thing that I've heard other people say. It's just I've heard that there is a cord that connects you in your incarnation, to your own body on a soul level. But I haven't heard this part about love. I haven't heard anybody else say this thing about love that I'm about to say. But I believe that love is a very potent essence of God, and that I believe that our souls are connected to God kind of like an umbilical cord when you're in the womb. And love is fed to us by God and saturates our souls through God's loving conscious essence, but also loving conscious essence. I kind of stumbled, but loving conscious essence. And also because it's a natural part of us because we're created of God, from my understanding. So it's already there within us, but it's activated that much more through this kind of umbilical cord style connection to God through our souls. And love gets wounded. When it comes into a world of suffering, it gets wounded. Very heavily wounded. In a world like this here on earth, it gets really, really wounded. And that wounding can present itself as sadness, fear, anger, confusion, doubt, sense of lack, loneliness, sense of loneliness, that sort of thing. But then nurtured and healed love present themselves as more positive emotions, typically, like faith, joy, sense of abundance, peace, that sort of thing. And so it is very important, in my opinion, to deeply honor negative emotions. And so to be that loving vessel in this world, deeply connected to the divine and deeply connected to God, in my opinion, you have to strongly revere, strongly honor emotional expression as divine communication. You have to strongly revere it, both in the negative and positive emotional ends of the spectrum. And so I don't think it's healthy in a world that has this amount of suffering. I do not think it is healthy to try and be 100% positive. That's not good. So anyway, I want to make that very clear. Okay, so the point is, with this math, you're looking at, like, as an example, to kind of summarize what I was saying before in the last, like, hour plus of this video. You want to land, what you want to do is you want to try to understand perspective, where you're looking at your soul's experience and how you naturally be shaped by this world. You look at other people close to you in your life and people even that you don't know, and God's creation in general, and try to imagine how sad or happy, averaged out, should you be based on that. If you do not believe in God, not if you don't believe in God, but as though you don't believe in God. Again, kind of like the tea bag, right? You're not fully disconnecting from your belief in God. You're just trying to get a greater sense of perspective. So you're lifting the tea bag up from the water a little bit. But the tea bag's still somewhat submerged. It's just not as heavily submerged temporarily. And then eventually you drop the tea bag back in after a few minutes, whatever it is. You go and say, again, after a few minutes, okay, I believe in God. I know I believe in God. I've gotten that perspective to get a number, whether it's 50, 60, 70, 40, 30, whatever, percent positive, right? Assuming that you didn't believe in God. And then, so imagining that you don't believe in God, because most people listening in this probably believe in God or the divine, but assuming you didn't believe in God or assuming you didn't believe in the divine, based on the level of suffering experience here in this incarnation that you've witnessed and that you've experienced yourself, how positive or negative would you be? Let's say you land at 50%, just to keep the math simple. Then you go and say, okay, my belief in God has me increased in hope by 50%. That lands me at 75% positive. You see what I'm saying? And so then what you can do is you can look at your life, and when you start to feel that you are not honoring your negative emotions nearly enough, you start listening to them more. Or if you sense that you're too negative, you start listening to your positive emotions more than you were. But this isn't for you to stay at the number 75 or whatever number you land on. This is to give you greater perspective, so you start really listening to and trying to understand your emotions better. And then you get to a place, I think you'll get to a place where you don't really need to do this very often, but if at all. But if you've been coming from a place where you suspect that you're super duper in the mental energy going and like heavily suppressing your negative emotions or heavily suppressing your positive emotions, you could probably, in my opinion, you could probably benefit quite a bit from this approach, because it's going to help you use your mind that you're so trained to and probably using too heavily. It's going to help you train your mind to be in union with your heart, to understand where your emotions are coming through, communicating to you the nurtured and healed and wounded love, right? Which comes through, in my opinion, as negative and positive emotions. So anyway, I hope that made sense. This is a long video, but it's still, interestingly, one of my shortest videos, at least on this subject. Okay, thank you. I'm going to, I guess, pause the video or end it actually. So thank you for listening to this. Bye.